Hi there, West Virginia. This is your partner in literacy, Melissa Webb with Amplify. I would like to thank you all for taking time out of your afternoon to sit down with us and talk about the science of reading. Now, some of you all have already received some sample bags for Amplify's Core Knowledge Language Arts program, and a lot of you all at some point during your literacy adoption will be receiving these items. And let me just tell you, when you begin to open it up, it is a program that you've never seen before. So at us at Amplify, we wanted to provide an opportunity to be able to sit down with you and allow you to gain some background knowledge. So you're able to make those connections and truly understanding the setup of Amplify CKLA, for we are founded on the science of reading. So I'm going to go ahead and hop right into things and introducing our first speaker. She is a West Virginia educator. Her name is Taylor Childers, and she is a third grade teacher located at Spring Hill Elementary in Cabell County. So Taylor, we would love to hear a brief testimonial on how Amplify CKLA has impacted you.
Hi. Okay, so I teach third grade, and I've taught third grade for, I think this is my 9th year actually teaching third grade, and I love it. It is my favorite. But throughout we've always done the county curriculum until last year. We decided we knew something was missing, and we were pulling things from all over the place, and just it wasn't working. There was always something that we just felt like was missing out of our curriculum. And our test results would always show that there is something missing, and something that we have always struggled with was vocabulary. And that was something huge that we were like, we have to do something different. So anyway, a group of us at my school, we actually asked permission if we could look into different curriculums. And so we got together, and we formed a panel of people, and we looked through everything. We went through ed reports, we did a lot of research, and we ended up finding CKLA. And it just felt right when we looked at it. And so we dug in more information, and then we ended up deciding as a group that this is what we wanted to do for our school. So our whole school, kindergarten through 5th grade, we adopted CKLA for our reading curriculum. So the year started, and we get our box of stuff, and of course, it's a lot of stuff. It was so many boxes, and we had to sift through it all. And, it did seem a little overwhelming at first, but as we dove in, we started, realizing that, well, first of all, the first unit was a struggle. I'm not going to lie, because we just weren't used to it yet. But by the second unit, our kids were used to everything. We were used to it. And it just started clicking, like everything was just running so smoothly, to the point where, and I thought this was the craziest thing, my gym teacher, who's taught at our school forever as well, he actually came to me. He said, we were chatting just in the hallway one day, and he was saying that the kids were telling him stuff that they were learning and reading. And I mean, I don't know the last time you talked to a third grader, but usually when you ask them what they learned that day, they say, I don't know, or nothing, the typical kid answer. So for them to go to gym class, their favorite class of the day, and tell him what they were learning and reading it was like a light bulb, like this is different. And so I thought that was one of my first moments. I felt so passionate that we were doing the right thing. And then, as the year goes on, they started doing the lunch teachers actually started playing trivia games with our kids and it was their favorite thing too, with the things that they were learning and reading. They would ask them questions, and the kids would get so excited just to answer the questions that they were, again, the things that they had been talking about during reading. And then I'm a mother of 3, and all of my kids are elementary age. So I have a 1st grader, a 3rd grader, and a 4th grader. And my kids, they go to a different school in our county, just because of location, and we live somewhere else. And so they still have the county curriculum. So as you know, we've had the blended schedule, and the kids, you know, have been learning from home. Well, a few days I've had to bring my kids to school with me. So they were doing their online classes while I was teaching my online class with my students. My third grader had a break in between her classes while I'm teaching CKLA, our reading curriculum. And she starts like looking at me while I'm teaching. And then she kind of moves closer to the table and is just listening to me and our activity that we were working on. It's actually Unit 4 right now, which is one of my favorites. It's about Rome, ancient Rome, and the kids love it. But anyway, so she starts listening to me, and at the end of my class, I signed off, and she was like, "What book are you reading?" And she was, you know, curious about it. So I showed her, and for the next hour, I swear this is the truth. For the next hour, she sat in a desk and like was looking through the book, reading all the stuff, and you know, I just, to me as a mom, like my kid just came to ask me about reading, and I mean, that was, it makes me want to cry a little bit, I'm not gonna lie. But that was just a huge thing, and I was just really excited about it. And I think that just shows that when you have a good curriculum, when you have something the kids want to read, it really, like, they will choose that over the, you know, I don't know, something else that they typically would rather choose, you know. So I thought that that was really awesome. So
That's
anyway.
wonderful. Yes, it's great to hear how Amplify CKLA has not only impacted you from a professional standpoint, but from a personal standpoint. And I love how you emphasized the stories. And that's one of the misperceptions that we've been hearing around the state is, you know, are these stories compelling enough for our elementary kids? And, you know, according to your testimonial, it's in your area, it's definitely something that's been attractive for your teacher or your students, in which they're talking to about these concepts outside of the classroom. So thank you so much for your time with your testimonial. I'm going to go ahead and go right into our main presenter. That is Susan Lambert. She is our Chief Academic Officer of Elementary Humanities here at Amplify. And some of you all may recognize that voice, for she is the host of the Science of Reading podcast, in which she sits down with educators all around the world to talk about literacy and how the science of reading has an impact. So Susan, oh, before we get started, we got to do some housekeeping real fast. I almost forgot. I wanted to let you guys know that if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box. And also wanted to reiterate that we do have a closed captioning option. If you simply click on the live transcript, you'll be able to get the written transcript as Susan is communicating to us about the science of reading. So Susan, the virtual floor is all yours.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks for the introduction. And Taylor, thanks for the testimonial. That's really great. Two things that I connected with that. First of all, third grade, amazing grade to teach, was my favorite grade to teach for sure. And that connection between seeing what happens with, as a professional connection with CKLA in the classroom, and also parents. So we hear that a lot about kids that get excited about the content, take that content home and talk to their parents about it, talk about it on the playground. So it's really powerful. I do want to remind folks that after the webinar, you will get a recording of this in your email. So we'll email this out to you. So if for some reason you have to step away for a second, or you missed something that I said and you wanted to write it down, have no fear. You'll get the recording so you can re-listen to it at your leisure. And I am happy to be here. I wish I could be in West Virginia in person, but this is the second best option. And all of us have learned to do things more remotely than what we used to do. So thank goodness for technology. And I'm still learning a little bit about it, but here we are, and we're going to take a step up, a little higher level view, and we're going to talk about science of reading and what it means to make that shift. And so we're going to do 5 things today. We're going to talk about science of reading. What does that mean? We're going to talk about national reading proficiency. And as I'm doing that, I want you to sort of think about how you fit in terms of your classroom or your school with the national proficiency data that we'll see. We're going to talk a little bit about frameworks of how kids learn to read or how proficient reading develops. We're going to get inside of the brain and look at some images of the brain and actually what happens inside our brain when we're reading. And then we'll end again with science of reading and talk about some principles that you can take away and actually look at in your school, in your classroom, to sort of judge how well things are going for you in terms of science of reading. So the other thing that I want you to remember is that as we're making a shift to doing anything new, that it can feel overwhelming. It can feel messy in the implementation process. It can feel confusing. You can get frustrated, but it's definitely worth the effort to start learning what this means, to start making some strides in the direction. And it is definitely something that we wanted to deliver to our students. And so we'll look at that in just a minute. So as promised, let's start with science of reading. What is science? What is reading? And I think if I were live, I'd have you write down definitions of both of those things. So just sort of formulate in your mind right now, what would you describe as science and what would you describe as reading? And let's talk through this a little bit. So what do we mean by science? And, when we're talking about ELA, we're not talking about principles of science, the content, but we're talking about the process of the scientific method. The thing about education is we're really prone to fads, and we've been prone to fads for a long time. And you all know this. You have been on the receiving end, I'm sure, of a lot of this. Oh, this is the new thing. It's research-based, it's evidence-based, and we need to implement this. Or we just found out the science of how kids do this. And so sometimes leadership can motivate us or try to motivate us to make shifts in our instructional practice or things we're doing in the school or in the classroom by couching it in research or evidence-based. And so what we want to do when we're thinking about how kids learn how to read is we want to remember that there is a science behind this that has accumulated evidence over many decades and continues to accumulate. And it's those principles of science that we want to use to help make shifts in our practice. So I'm going to start with No Child Left Behind, which we know is outdated right now, but in 2002, scientifically based research was described as research that involves the application of rigorous, systematic, and objective procedures. So it's not the, oh, I sort of heard that this might work and I'm going to try this with my kids. That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about evidence-based. We're talking about a body of knowledge that has been tested and retested and is actually shown to be effective, which leads me to ESSA in 2015 outlined evidence-based practices as those activities, strategies, interventions that are in the classroom that show a statistically significant effect on improving student outcomes. We're not going to go into statistics and what all that means, but in other words, they have applied the scientific method to study the thing that's being implemented in the classroom, and it has been shown and shown again to have an impact on student learning. And so when we talk about the science of reading, and I've heard people say, well, your science isn't my science. That is kind of a myth and a misunderstanding of really what we mean by science. What we mean is somebody has developed a hypothesis. They've tested this hypothesis with groups of students, both a control group. They've observed some results. They've looked at the results and revised that hypothesis if needed and repeated that experiment again. And those things, those successful hypotheses that are shown to be successful across multiple experiments bubble up to become theories. And it's this accumulation of evidence that we're going to look at that is shown to have an impact in the classroom. And when we come to classroom instruction, school-based instruction, systematic instruction, any of that, when we come to that, what we want to do is come with the mind of a scientist to say, this is proven to have results. And if it's proven to have results, we owe it to our children to deliver that to them. We think about this sometimes in the medical field, right? When you go to the doctor and there is either something right with you or something not right, either way, you want that doctor to actually know the evidence that has been proven to be successful in terms of keeping you healthy or treating you when you're unhealthy. And you wouldn't want your practitioner, your doctor to say to you, well, I kind of like to do it my own way, so I'm going to give you this thing. We really want to be grounded in the science in what we're delivering to kids, and keep that in mind as we start to look at and unfold what this means. So what do we mean by reading? This sounds kind of silly to define this question, right? But I think it's really important that we do define it so that we can then understand what it takes to become a confident and capable reader. And I took this right from Reading Rockets. I forgot to put that on here, but if you are not familiar with that website, Reading Rockets is an excellent place to go as you're starting to develop your knowledge of reading science. Lots of great resources there, everything from research to videos to practical strategies you can implement in the classroom. So please take advantage of that site. But according to Reading Rockets, and I think we would all agree with this, that reading is really making meaning from print. And you'll notice that I put both words meaning and print in orange because it's not one without the other, right? You have to have both. You have to be able to identify the words in print. You have to construct some kind of understanding of what those words are. Our brain needs to coordinate this identification and understanding of words, and we're going to talk about that when we look at the brain. And then we need to develop automaticity and accuracy. So I'm going to guess that all of you looked at all of the words that are on my slide right now, and you automatically recognize those. And that's not because you memorized them on flashcards when you were in kindergarten or first grade, or even in 5th or 6th grade. The reason that you recognize those is because you spent time decoding those words. And the more that you recognize them, the more and the more automatic you become. So that's the goal, is automaticity, to do something without thinking about it. And so we're going to unpack that a little bit too. So when we talk about the science of reading, we talk about science and what the scientific method is and the accumulation of evidence. And we talk about making meaning from print. So I'm going to stop and just have you read this. And this is from Louisa Moats, one of the experts in reading science. And I think for me, two things really jump out that are super important here is the first few words, most reading failure is unnecessary. And then what it says at the end, researchers now estimate that 95% of all children can be taught to read by the end of first grade. And I want you to think about the impact of what that would look like. Is it possible? And what would it look like at your school if by the time the kids left first grade, 95% of those kids were actually reading? And we do know it's possible. There's schools across the country that have implemented science of reading methods that have made it a goal to have 80% or more of their kids reading by the end of first grade. And they've actually accomplished that goal with good, focused, sustained effort, which is why it's really important to understand what we mean by the science of reading. So let's first start talking about national reading proficiency. And what I'm going to show you is 4th grade NAEP reading scores from 2019. So the most recent administration of the 4th grade NAEP scores. And I'm going to show it in a little different way than I typically show it. And I'd like you to just look at this graph and orient yourself just a little bit to what it looks like. You'll notice on the left hand, sort of up and down, we have the years starting in 1992 all the way up to 2019. And then along the bottom, we actually have the percent of kids that are either proficient or not proficient. And the green line represents, that green 0 line, that represents proficiency. So you'll notice to the right of that green line are the percent of kids that are proficient, meaning they're at or above the level of NAEP proficiency in 4th grade. And what's curious about this is you'll notice to the left of that green line is the number of students or the percent of students that are not proficient. So this is our trend in 4th grade. Not a surprise, you've heard it before, that this trend has essentially stayed the same over time, and we're making very little progress in terms of moving the needle here. Now, I think I just said that researchers have demonstrated that we can get 95% of our kids reading at proficiency in grade 1. Well, what happens in what's happening here? Why are we not able to move the bar in terms of reading achievement levels? So we're going to unpack that a little bit, but know, 4th grade teachers, that this is not a 4th grade problem, right? This isn't even a 3rd grade problem. This is an issue of what do we do with the students when they come to us as kindergartners, and how do we impact their instruction? So if we disaggregate this a little bit and look at this, this NAEP data, what I'm showing you now, if you can, look at that title, it says now we're going to look at the percent that are below basic. So overall, we have 34% of students that are functioning below basic level, right? So this isn't even sort of below proficiency. This is below the basic level. And if you look at the graph, you can see the percentage of all those kids that are performing below basic, how this splits out. And you can see that, the learners that are impacted the most by this. I think this is it's a sad slide, but what we know is with good, strong core instruction in the classroom, beginning in the early grades, we can have an impact on this. Again, back to Louisa Moats, who says 95% of kids can learn how to read. That's not 95% of certain groups. That's 95% of all of our kids. So we can have a good, strong impact with evidence-based practices in classrooms. All right, let's shift down now to 1st grade. Remember that 1st grade, 95%. We can get most of our kids reading by the end of 1st grade. Pretend that you had a classroom. Oh, I hope you don't, but let's pretend you had a classroom of 50 kids. And these are 50 students in your classroom, and you had 50 students that were all below grade level. They're not functioning where they need to be in 1st grade. So I want you to make a prediction in your head. Of these 50 students that are performing below grade level, remember they're 1st graders, how many of those students are going to continue to be performing below grade level later in their schooling career? So make a prediction, make a guess. If you guessed 44 out of 50, you're right. So what the data tells us, and this has been replicated over time, what the data tells us is that by the end of 1st grade, if you're not reading where you're supposed to be reading, it's very likely you are never going to catch up. And we usually think about things like the NAEP proficiency in 4th grade, or we think about end of 3rd grade, right? There's significant data that shows at the end of 3rd grade, if you're not reading on grade level, it impacts your future schooling and your career. But actually, it's all the way down to 1st grade. If you are not on track in 1st grade, you're very likely not going to be on track unless you receive a different kind of instruction and some strong intervention. So we want to prevent that because we know we can. And Seidenberg tells us that one thing we can control is what happens in the classroom, and it has lasting impact, right? Reading, teaching kids to learn to read has lasting impacts, and we can make a difference there. I've been in the classroom. I totally get it. Kids come to us from a variety of backgrounds and a variety of experiences. And sometimes it's really easy to say, well, that kid came from this place, or this is happening outside the school, or, right? And But what we do know is if we have strong instruction in the classroom, we can actually impact their education and we can be the ones to change their life trajectory. So let's take a step back and let's talk a little bit in theory, but I want you to think about that slide, remember from Reading Rockets, that said reading is all about making meaning from print, and think about those two words that I highlighted in orange. And we're going to talk a little bit about what it takes. So reading ability really only comes as a combination of two things. That's decoding, knowing the words on the page, and language comprehension, understanding language and being able to comprehend it. We call this actually the simple view of reading. This research has been around since the 80s, and this framework has been replicated multiple times. So that is one of the hallmarks of science, right? Is it replicable, and did it retest? Can we retest this theory and retest this theory? And does it show similar results? The simple view of reading now is been replicated so many times that we now draw on that to better understand reading proficiency. So you cannot be a proficient reader without these two things. And you'll notice reading proficiency is a product of language comprehension and word recognition. The reason this is important is it's not additive, right? So if you put numbers into this equation, if you have 0 ability in language comprehension and you have 100, your ability in word recognition is, let's say, 100 on a scale of 0 to 100, you end up with 0 reading proficiency because 0 times 100 is 0. If you can't comprehend what you're lifting off the page, you're not a proficient reader. Likewise, if you can comprehend, you have a large vocabulary, you understand lots of things about lots of topics, you can have great conversations, but you can't recognize words on the page, you're still not a proficient reader. And so whatever we do in the classroom, we have to pay attention to both sides of this equation. Language comprehension, let's talk just a little bit about what that is. It's really the ability to understand and make sense of spoken language. It's making meaning from what you hear. And the more that you can make meaning from what you hear, the more vocabulary you can understand, the more you can engage in conversations, the better your language comprehension. It develops naturally from birth. So babies are born to be language comprehenders. They're born to speak and they're born to listen. We actually listen or take that information in first before we start to speak, but it develops naturally. Language comprehension also develops over the span of your lifetime. So I'm continuing to learn new things. I'm learning new vocabulary words. I'm learning new things about different topics. That all builds my language comprehension, because if I understand a vocabulary word, I can better read, right? So this language comprehension continues to grow over your lifetime. Word recognition, on the other hand, does not grow over your lifetime. Word recognition is intended to be one and done. So we're going to look at what that process looks like. But kids can't just stare at books and the words magically lift off the page. We actually have to teach them. And so word recognition is this ability to read the words on the page. It involves automaticity of decoding. We can't rely on kids memorizing words because that would just take too much cognitive energy. It's something that we have to explicitly teach. We can't put kids in a room like a library filled with books and expect them to just learn how to decode words or learn how to read. It's something we must teach. We have not evolved to be able to develop this naturally. And we're going to look at the brain processes that helps us do this. One of the misconceptions about teaching phonics or teaching word recognition is that you do it forever. You actually don't. The goal of this is within 2 years. If kids are taught with effective instruction, they should have this word recognition so we can completely put our cognitive energy into language comprehension. We don't want kids to be decoders forever. We want them to develop automaticity. Remember what I said about that slide previously? I bet all of you can look at this slide and you don't have to decode any of those words. It's automatic. And that's the process we want to create for our students. So what does this mean? The simple view doesn't say that your, perfection in decoding is going to get perfection in reading. It says that if you're a perfect decoder, you're going to read just as well as you can listen. And so your listening comprehension or your language comprehension impacts then your ability to read. And so these two things work together in sort of in tandem. It helps us also understand and explain the different types of readers that we have. So if we put this on a 4x4 grid and we look at the bottom at word recognition, so this would be no word recognition on the left-hand side, lots of word recognition on the right-hand side, low language comprehension on the bottom, high language comprehension on the top. It helps us explain the different types of readers. So obviously, we want skilled readers. We want kids that are high in word recognition and high in language comprehension. But we know that sometimes we have different kinds of readers. And so if you have the opposite of that, you're low in word recognition and low in language comprehension, researchers call this garden variety poor readers, or just general poor reading ability, that you have to actually work on helping the kids understand both parts of this, word recognition and language comprehension. But sometimes you have kids that are not good at word recognition, but they're really good at language comprehension. If you read them something aloud, they understand the text that's being read aloud. They can carry on great conversations. They can dive deep into topics and have conversations with you about that topic. They have good vocabulary. We call these kids dyslexic. So those are the kids that actually need help understanding the mapping of sounds to letters and developing fluency, and they need more time in that. On the other end, sometimes we have kids that are we sometimes call them word callers, is that they can read the words, they can actually decode the words. Those skills are well in place, but they're not able to comprehend what they read. This is hyperlexic kids are a smaller minority. Sometimes we think we have more kids that just have a comprehension issue, but when we sort of dig in and do the assessments, what we find out is they actually haven't learned to map all those sound spelling patterns, and they haven't become automatic with that. And once we fix that, it fixes the comprehension. But there are sometimes kids that really need support in comprehension. And then this is where you would get a language specialist to help you identify strategies to work with that kid. So the simple view of reading really helps us understand the different types of readers. Now, I love this quote because the simple view of reading doesn't mean that it's actually simple or easy, because learning to read is a really complex restructuring of the brain. And again, it's unnatural. It's unnatural, and we have to actually create new pathways in our brain. So we have to rewire our brain to teach it how to read. And we're going to dig in and look at what that looks like in terms of the brain. But it's not a simple thing or easy. Rather, it's just a way to a construct to look at what it takes to become a proficient reader. So many of you may be familiar with this rope, Scarborough's reading rope. Hollis Scarborough actually developed this reading rope. She did it initially to help parents understand what it takes to become a proficient reader. And now we use it to really dive into or understand all the strands, if you will, of what it takes to learn how to read. If you can see down here, if you were thinking about the simple view of reading, you notice up here is the language comprehension part. And down here, the green part is this word recognition part. And so language comprehension is comprised of your background knowledge, your vocabulary, your ability to put together and understand sentences and make connections in those sentences to get a gist of the passage. And the word recognition is really understanding sounds. That the beginning part of reading is all about speech, and then taking those sounds and mapping them to letters or combinations of letters to form words. And we'll see like this actually starts at birth. Many of these things develops in preschool. When we get to kindergarten, it's really important in the K1, 2 that we focus on these things discreetly, language comprehension and word recognition, because again, we want kids to become very automatic in terms of reading and writing words, so that our cognitive energy then can be put into the comprehension side. Our language comprehension development helps us to become pretty strategic. And so when we get to grades 3, 4, 5, and beyond, we're talking about taking these skills, weaving them together to form really tight connections to become then what I call confident, capable, proficient readers. The interesting thing about those of us that are proficient is if you're a proficient reader, you actually forget what it took to get to be reading proficiency. And so when we backtrack and try to think about all the sounds that the kids hear and how to help them focus on sounds, it takes us some cognitive energy to go back and learn that. And so it's just a really interesting process we have to go through. When your brain develops automaticity, it forgets what it did to be able to develop that automaticity. We talked about already this language comprehension as the ability to understand oral language. That's right here on the top of Scarborough. We call these the higher level processing skills. And then word recognition, we call lower level processing skills. And the reason they're lower level is 1, they're foundational, and 2, they're lower level because anything that's a lower level skill, you can actually practice, and it becomes automatic. And that's what we want to happen. And then again, the goal of this is increasingly strategic, increasingly automatic for reading proficiency. So that's a couple of frameworks, the simple view of reading framework, and then Scarborough's reading rope, and how both of those two things are related to each other, how Hollis Scarborough sort of unpacked that simple view of reading to help us understand a little bit more. What we're going to do is we're going to get inside the brain, and I'm going to show you some imaging of what happens in the brain when we actually approach speech or the language comprehension and reading the word recognition. And then we're going to look at another model that helps us understand how that happens. So what you're looking at right now is obviously a brain, and you're looking at it from sort of from the left side. All the spots that are fired up there in red, these are really millions of neurons, and this is the part of the brain that has activity. So the same thing you're going to apply to all the images that we see. Anything that's in a color like this is really some activity that's happening in a brain. So right now we're looking at a time-lapse sequence. So just look at it from left to right for a minute. And this is all about the spoken word. This is what happens when somebody speaks a word. Not reading the word, but actually just speaking. And so you'll notice when you say a word, where does your brain start to fire up? Right there in the middle and on the left side of the brain. And in less than a second, you can see how it spreads downward and forward until a really big chunk there of the left side fires up or lights up. This is the part of the brain that we're looking at right now that's actually involved in speech. I want you to look at the rear of the brain here. You'll notice this back part of the brain, it's dark. So keep that in mind. Remember, this is just speech. We're just speaking words. This is what's happening in my brain right now because I'm speaking. Again, notice the back part of the brain is dark, no speech involved at all. Promise this is going to make sense. Now, this time lapse is a different time lapse sequence. This is actually showing the sequence of somebody reading a word as opposed to speaking it. And you'll notice when you're reading a word, where does your brain start to fire? All the way in the back, a long way from your eyes, but that's sort of where the visual signals are sent. And then you notice across, as you go across, that the brain activity is spreading. You see where it's spreading. This is what happens with a skilled reader. So this is actually an image of a skilled reader reading a word. Now remember, where is the speech part? So when you actually are then reading a word or writing a word, this is the circuit that happens. Now, what we have to do, so we go back here, what we have to do is we actually have to connect these two things together, because remember, reading actually starts with speaking, and all reading is lifting ideas off the page. So the technology of the creation of the written word requires our brain to connect the speech sounds with the writing on the page. So what's happening in the brain when this is happening? So we call this the 4-part processing model. A lot of David Kilpatrick's work has been developing this model, and it's been reinforced with brain imaging. So remember, we were talking about the preponderance of evidence that's building for this. So this is a model. This model they tested, and then they looked at the brain imaging, and we have the evidence that, yeah, this is actually how it works. So this 4-part processing model is inside the brain. This is the phonological processor, the speech. Remember where our brain fires for that. You saw an image of that. We have the orthographic processor. All orthographics means is print, right? So in the print model, remember we looked at the imaging, starts in the back of the brain. We also have this thing called meaning. What we have inside of our brain is a whole lexicon of words. And these 3 things need to work together. We're going to pull them apart and look at them in a minute. Every once in a while, when we're establishing meaning in print, we have to access what we call our context processor. So this would be things like multiple meaning words, pair and pair, right? We recognize the word, but we have to access our context processor to understand which pair is used in context. And so context is an important part of the reading process, but it's an important part for meaning making as opposed to word recognition. So let's unpack this a little bit. You may recognize this as a lower level process. So if we were in person, I'd tell you to turn and talk to somebody next to you to identify what part of the simple view of reading this represents. And if you said word recognition, you are absolutely right. Because what needs to happen is we need to understand speech. And if I say cat, how is that represented in print? And these 2 things work back and forth. And this is called orthographic mapping, if any of you have heard that term. And our brain needs to go back and forth in this processing model to create a really, really, really strong connection. The more practice that we get with this, the better we are at automaticity. So that place of automaticity, this is where it needs to happen. We also have this meaning processor, the lexicon, and the content processor or context processor I was talking about. Turn and talk to your neighbor, right? And say, where are you finding this in the simple view of reading? You should have recognized this as language comprehension, the language comprehension element. The interesting thing is when our brain works, these 3 things help each other. So let me give you an example. When kids come to us in kindergarten and have really large vocabularies, so their language comprehension is lots of background knowledge and lots of vocabulary words to work with, they are actually better poised to start making these connections, because we know that the bigger your vocabulary, the easier it is to recognize words if you're taught these sort of sound spelling mappings. And so these things don't necessarily work in isolation inside your brain as you're building those neural networks. They work together to help support each other. And the more you get mapping here, the greater access you have to your meaning processor or your lexicon. So it's not an either or. It's not like, oh, we're just going to build the kids' background knowledge and vocabulary and build their language comprehension, or we're just going to be teaching our kids phonological awareness and phonemic awareness and phonics. No, we have to do both and if we're going to set our kids up for success. And that's what the evidence of the science of reading will tell us. So that's kind of a lot, I know, and especially if you're new to this, it can feel really overwhelming. So we like to put it in ways that are sort of principles to remember. And so I'd like to walk through some of those principles. And there's 7 of them. First of all, we already heard that reading is not natural. It can and must be taught. And there's ways that we know that are more effective and less effective in terms of teaching reading. Many people ask, well, don't some kids sort of figure this out on their own? And all the reading scientists would say, yes, there are some kids that can figure this out on their own, but that's very few. And what we have learned from the evidence is that, you know what? Instruction, explicit instruction to help teach kids how to read hurts nobody. So there's no negative impact on kids that may already know these sound spelling mappings. As a matter of fact, we need to teach them all because sometimes kids only have some of them and their reading is fragile. And so when we get to multisyllabic words, we find that there's holes, and some of that is actually borne out in the 4th grade NAEP data. So reading is not natural. It can and must be taught. Remember, go back to the Louisa Moats quote that 95% of our kids can learn how to read by the end of 1st grade. We know that background knowledge is as critical to comprehension as decoding skills. So when you have strong background knowledge, it helps you decode, but it also helps you understand text much, much better. What we do know is foundational skills needs to be systematic and explicit, beginning with the sounds. So we need to start kids understanding this alphabetical principle that every single piece of code is represented by a letter. And so we need to teach kids to hone in and understand the really, really small parts, or the phonemes of our language. It was the National Reading Panel in 2000 that actually highlighted the evidence for systematic and explicit instruction. And for those of you that say, well, that was 20 years ago, surely things have changed since then. That's old science. There's actually no such thing as old science. The evidence continues to mount that systematic and explicit instruction is the approach that kids need when it comes to foundational skills. But it doesn't have to be drill and kill. It needs to be engaging, and it can be engaging. Another myth, right? Like this kind of instruction is boring. It's not. And actually, when kids are taught in multimodal approaches using all their senses, the instruction is sticky and the instruction is fun. And so we need to engage in ways that make it fun for kids. Number 5 is so critical and so important. It goes back to the Louisa Moats quote again. It goes back to what we know about response to intervention and multi-tiered systems of supports. There's a reason that the tier 1 is so important, because if we get our core instruction right, it reduces the need for intervention later. It allows children to move forward as capable and confident learners. And so that quality core instruction that you're delivering for all students is super important, that it's based on science-based reading instruction. And that leads to number 6, it's really a matter of equity. Remember the NAEP data that we looked at and the inequity we saw in terms of the performance. What we know is that when we start strong with science-based reading instruction, we can reduce that. We can ensure that all students can read. And number 7, we really believe that reading instruction is urgent. Reading instruction is the most crucial work of the elementary school teacher, and we often talk about the urgency as saving literacy lives. We know that in kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, if we can get kids on track, and we can, that we then set them up in and for success in every aspect of their life, later schooling and just later success. And it's a really urgent need. When you're looking at then your overall literacy program, I like to remind folks that we shouldn't just be focusing on science-based practices in core instruction or intervention, but we really need our system of literacy to work together. And as you're looking at, you know, and sort of stepping into making a shift to science-based practices, you need to evaluate the tools that you're using in the classroom to ensure that they're all aligned with it. So does your core instruction deliver science-based reading practices? Are you extending that core instruction in differentiated instruction and in practice with tools that actually extend from that evidence-based practices? Does your intervention also extend from that? Does it support the kids in learning more? Remember, intervention should always be in addition to that core instruction. And then are you gathering the kinds of data that helps you understand where kids are in their process and ties the system together? So all of those things need to talk to each other and need to all be aligned to science-based practices. So I'm going to end just with a little plug for the podcast, not because it's my podcast, but we talked to some amazing folks. And what we're doing in the newest season is we're really deconstructing Scarborough's rope to understand all the different elements involved. And so we're going to look at each element of the rope, both word recognition and language comprehension, and really talk to experts who have been doing this work or who have been helping to translate this work for teachers. And I am super excited about the podcast episode that released today. I had a great discussion with my good friend, Alice Wiggins, who happens to be right now at Unbounded as the Vice President of Instructional Design and Products. But she talks to us about what word recognition really means. And she is one of these folks that can translate the research and has worked with practitioners so often that it's just very well outlined. And so I encourage you, if you haven't listened to an episode yet, that you make Alice Wiggins' episode your first episode because it's just, it's really great. So I think that is all that I had to say. And I'm wondering what kind of questions that may have come in the chat. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Let's see if I can do this and see if we can look at any questions that came in. Melissa.
Hey, Susan, Nathan here. I've got my little guy, Oliver, with us. He
Hi,
just got home
Oliver.
from daycare, so he's making an appearance. Hi, everybody. Susan, one of the big questions that we did have come in had to do with just a quick overview of how K-Ckla fits into the science of reading. I know that's a really loaded question, but if you could just give us like a quick 90-second overview of how K-Ckla fits into the science of reading.
Great. Can you see my screen again?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to go back to Scarborough. We'll stop right here. So K-Ckla is a 2-strand program in K2 and a 1-strand in 3-5. And some people wonder, oh, well, why is it a 2-strand program? Well, like Melissa said, K-Ckla is built on the science of reading. It truly is. So we have a strand called the knowledge strand. This knowledge strand is about 60 minutes of instruction, but it's delivered as read-alouds in K2. These read-alouds are well above what kids could decode themselves because listening comprehension outpaces reading comprehension. What we're doing is helping kids learn how to gain knowledge from text and build their vocabulary. And so this language comprehension side is the knowledge side. We also have the skills strand, which is all about word recognition, teaching kids the sound spelling patterns, how to read them, how to write them, how to practice them with connected decodable text that gives them that volume of reading and practice they need to have to develop automaticity. At grade 3, you'll see this rope where it's kind of got some space in between. Grade 3 is still about a 120-minute program where we're starting to decrease the read aloud. We still do it, starting to decrease it, but bringing the content together, and we move into morphology to help again with that automaticity. And then in grades 4 and 5, those strands are coming together and kids are reading and writing, and they've got all the skills they need to be able to do that. So that's just like the high level view of how K-Ckla actually maps onto this. We could put teacher guides here. You'd have all your knowledge teacher guides here. You'd have all your skills teacher guides here, and then your 3rd grade teacher guides here, and then your 4th and 5th grade ones there. Thanks for that question, whoever asked it.
Yes, wonderful. Real fast, since we have some time, Taylor, can I get you back on for a second? I was just now thinking as Susan was going over those two strands and the knowledge one in particular, I know if we had an opportunity to sit down with you, one of the questions that I really wanted to ask you in regards to background knowledge or our knowledge is what difference have you seen with your incoming students this year in comparison to pre-CKLA?
So this is a super easy answer for me because something that I noticed, and like I said, I've been a teacher. It's my 12th year, but my 9th year in 3rd grade. So each year, something that we really struggle with is the kids. We can teach them, you know, a format of how to write and what to, like, the idea to put the stuff on the paper. But the number one thing that we have a problem with every single year is the kids will sit there and I'll say, well, what do you want to write? And they'll say, I don't know. I don't know what to write. And so this will be an ongoing thing, like throughout the year, that they just can't, they don't have the ideas to put on the paper. So getting started is just a disaster usually. But even by mid-year last year, after we really got in the flow of things, that was changing. They had something right. If anything, I have to like be like, okay, well, make sure you stay on top, because they just have so much that they're trying to pull from. And even my kids that have IEPs, I just have, I'm thinking of one specific student right now in my head, that she has so much to say, and it's sure is, you know, there are some things that we still need to work on. It's not perfect by any means, but she has so much to put down, and that's just the biggest thing that I've taken from CKLA, is that the kids really, because there is so much knowledge built on before they start writing, they have so much information that it's very easy for them to come up with a million things to write about, and that's just huge.
Absolutely. And you know, that content is built starting as early as kindergarten all the way through 8th grade. So, you know, a content rich curriculum built with, you know, having that rigorous vocabulary really does make a difference with reading comprehension for sure. Well, Taylor, thank you for your time and your testimonial here this evening. And Susan, we really appreciate you providing us those important principles behind in the science of reading and really understanding that, you know, reading is something that needs to be taught. So now that you all understand why we do what we do, if you would like to chime in and get more of an overview of who we are and what we do have some opportunities within West Virginia that we'll be presenting. Amplify's Core Knowledge Language Arts program. The very first one will be taking place on February the 8th at 3:00 with the West Virginia virtual caravan that's going to be taking place. And for you West Virginia Reading Associated members, they have orchestrated an opportunity where we have done pre-recordings, and you at any time of the day, I believe it opens up February 14th through February 28th. You could be easily sitting on your couch eating a bag of popcorn in your pajamas, and you can learn more about Amplify CKLA, for they will have that open for you all to chime in. Again, I'd like to thank you all, you West Virginia educators, for taking the time to sit down and understand the science of reading. And I'm going to leave a few more minutes here. If you all have any questions, please feel free to ask. We'll be sure to stay on a little bit afterwards if you'd like to, you know, talk to us personally about a few things. If you have no questions, you're, you know, more than welcome to hop off. And I know I'll be seeing a lot of you all here soon. Thanks.
Susan and Taylor, thanks so much. That was so fun.
Yes.
That was awesome. I know people are dropping off. Maybe we'll get a couple people to hang out, but I just wanted to thank you guys. I learned a lot, and that was an awesome event. So thank you.
Yes, Susan, I think every time I listen to you, I just get more and more information.
Well, it was great, Taylor. It was great to have you on and just hear sort of impact it's having on your students. I love that you talked about writing, and you know, I'm sure people are dropping off now, but I remember one of the very first school visits that I did, oh, it's been years ago now, and it was out west. And the principal said to me, you have to come see what's on the wall before we have this meeting. And I walked down to look at the wall, and, you know, there was the kids' writing was all over the wall. And she said to me, the principal said, we have done 0 changes with writing instruction, right? Like we're just implementing CKLA, and all of a sudden our kids have all of this to write about with vocabulary that they can use it. And she's like, it's amazing when kids are excited about content and when they, you know, they have the words to be able to put on paper. And we hear that a lot, that it's changed the writing.
Yeah,
Oh,
definitely.
yeah, so much. It really, like right now, I told you we were in Unit 4, which is Ancient Rome, and one of the opinion, it's an opinion writing piece. So, and even with an opinion writing, like a couple years ago, before we started this, they still they couldn't even form an opinion. Like I don't know, that was just such a huge struggle. And then to back up that opinion with like, well, because I just think that, you know, and so that's something that I don't know, it's just amazing to be able for them to say, okay, the topic is Julius Caesar a hero or a traitor? And they would like argue back and forth. We've had like debates like, well, no, because he, you know, it's just so much information, and it's just so, I don't know, it really has made a huge difference.
Yeah, that's really cool. And that's one of my favorite units, actually. I love, and the writer of that unit, oh, she's a really good friend of mine, but I love, that's a great example of how you use the text to actually scaffold and help them understand how to do that writing, but then the importance of talking about it, to be able to get your ideas, talk through your ideas, be secure in your ideas before you actually write. So that's a great, I love it.
Donna, it looks like we got a great question here regarding interventions. We have a number of awesome interventions, including a brand new intervention toolkit, especially designed for K3. So really, really fantastic stuff. We'll probably follow up with a video and some links so that you can explore that. It's a rather lengthy conversation. We're happy to have that in person if you like, but we don't want to take up too much of your time this evening.
The great part of the intervention that's there too is it's an extension of the core. So the kids aren't going to get something different. They're going to get more of what they need to be able to be successful.
Yes. And Donna, please feel free to reach out to me via email as I work on getting some of that stuff together. Because not only do we have daily intervention built within the core, and we have small group instruction in place. The intervention toolkit is very exciting. I had some time to sit down with it this past weekend for a couple of hours and was just intrigued with all of the information that's available for you to implement, you know, if effective instruction for your students. So.
Awesome. Well, I think that's it, guys.
All right.
All right.
Very good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care, everyone. Good night.
Have a great evening.
Bye.